Secure boot on some of the old computers that might be running Linux has expired. What does this mean for your computer, and is this something we need to worry about? Today we're going to talk about secure boot, the expiration, and the things we might need to do as Linux users. Welcome back to Switch Linux. If you like this type of content, subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. Leave us a like and a comment down below. Yes, as of a couple of days ago, the old secure boot certificates have expired on old computers. Now, if you're constantly running Windows and running Windows updates, you probably already have the new secure boot certificates, which started rolling out in 2023. Also, if you're using some versions of Linux and some supported hardware that run a firmware update or application, you may also already have those certificates. But what we want to talk about is what happens if you don't, and does this impact you at all? And the first point here is that what does secure boot do? What it effectively does is it makes sure that the operating system, which is booting, is the operating system that is signed to boot. Now, the challenge here is that the way secure boot works now, first, every one of these signing certificates is done by Microsoft. So even if you have a Linux distribution supporting secure boot, it is still signed by Microsoft. And what has happened is distributions which support secure booting have a shim in there that basically allows this to read the certificate and then pass it off to the Linux distribution. Still, you're dependent on Microsoft. Now, is that necessarily a problem? Well, the thing is, I actually just turn off secure boot and I don't even worry about it, even if I'm running a distro that supports it, because ultimately, there's a couple different opinions here. One of those is that many people believe that secure boot is only there to protect your actual physical machine from actual physical attacks. That's not entirely true, but the type of malware that is actually prevalent that would attack these, they actually have not really been making these because most computers are Windows, most computers have secure boot, and most of that malware just wouldn't work on those computers. Not to say that if large amounts of Linux users are disabling secure boot and running it that way, creating a big enough target, yeah, we might actually see some form of remote execution that allows that to run. But the challenge is on Linux, even if you have secure boot disabled, is whatever malware they're doing has to get write access to the root account to modify your boot sector, which is not necessarily as trivial. Now, is it possible? Absolutely. But is it something that the average person should worry about if they follow generally good practices using their computers? The answer is no, probably not. Now, the next thing you need to know about this is that your computer is not going to stop working. So if you have an old computer that you have sitting around that you already have Linux on, you pull it out every couple days, maybe every couple weeks to do something, just because those certificates have expired does not mean the system will not boot. What that basically means is that when you install that distribution, it's going to sync that in with the current certificates, and it's going to allow the system to work as long as that operating system there is not changed as far as the boot sector. Now, that could change if you're running something that rolls a lot and you have an update, and that update relies on secure boot, and you have secure boot turned on, and you're running an older unpatched version of your UEFI board that does not actually have the certificates installed. Yeah, you might run into a problem, but by and large, if your operating system is already on the computer, you're not going to have any problems. If you need to reinstall it, or if you need to seriously modify the bootloading of it, you might run into a problem there. Now, here on Linux, there are a few things that you can do. So the first is check your board manufacturer. Now, unfortunately, I'm using an MSI board, and that means all of the firmware updates are exe files. Oh, Lord, I have to do them through that. I think actually there is a way I can put those on a USB drive and update it that way. But you'd go onto your board's manufacturer, you look to see if the firmware is there, and you would just do a manual update of the firmware of your BIOS of your computer. That will install the latest certificates. Obviously, if you have a Windows partition, you probably already have them. Boot into that Windows operating system, run all of the updates, and you should have all of those updated certificates. The last thing that you could do is many Linux distributions are now shipping with a firmware updater. Now, not every single computer actually has that. Not every computer has that firmware tool installed, and if you do, not every motherboard supports it. But in the event you do happen to have a board that does, UPDMGR refresh will check for new updates, get updates will grab those, and then update will install firmware updates. So if you happen to have one of the manufacturers which is supporting firmware upgrades, and remember HP just jumped onto this, I believe Dell and Lenovo were already doing this. So as long as you have this application on your Linux build, you should be able to run this and get those updated firmware builds as well. So ultimately, this is not the end of the world. This is not like an SSL that once it expires, the thing stops working. Your old computer will continue to work. But if you have a laptop that's sitting in the corner and every couple weeks you might spin it up and throw a new Linux distro on it for testing, if you're relying on secure boot and you have never had updates to the firmware of that computer and you don't run Windows on it for a long time, you might have distros that are not booting. But most of the likely, if you happen to have one of those computers sitting around that is a distro testing computer, you probably have secure boot disabled anyway, in which case it's all moot. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter in the end. Just be aware that if you do not have these latest certificates from Microsoft, secure boot may not work until you get those on, whatever means you have to do that. And you may have problems installing a new operating system with secure boot disabled. Now, should you keep secure boot enabled or not? If you hunt around, again, I talked about this in a video recently. It is impossible to do internet research these days because AI slop is just, you enter a keyword and you get 50 to 100 articles of the exact same thing. You do, hey, find me cases where secure boot was ineffective. Every article you can find is 50 pages deep on whatever search engine, like whatever search engine you're using, is all the exact same article. It's insanely stupid. Thank you, AI. You totally ruined the internet. But I do remember covering in our weekly news roundup not terribly long ago, maybe a year or so ago, of some secure boot malware that was still able to sneak through. But is it something you should do? Well, I don't know. I'm on the fence about it. Most of the discussions about it, they're actually kind of talking about, well, this protects your system from physical access. Is that really the case? Well, unless you have a password on your BIOS, it's very trivial to turn it off. And then the physical access will allow you to do a whole bunch of more nefarious things than do something in between the operating system and the disk. But as some people had mentioned in here, not only physical access, but there are ways to install something malicious remotely. But on Linux, that's going to require you gaining write access to the boot sector, which is not a trivial task. Again, it is doable. If you are in a super high secure environment, you probably are going to want to turn that on. If you go to riskier places on the internet, you might want to turn that on. But if you're an average, generally good practiced computer person running Linux distributions, you're probably safe without that being on. So that is kind of my thoughts on it. You should weigh that yourself. Of course, your attempts to do internet searches is going to find you 50 articles that say the same AI slop thing. No matter what. So let me know your thoughts about all of this in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.